This is the story of Archduchess Mathilde of Austria, an 18-year-old princess whose life in the opulent Austro-Hungarian Empire ended in a horrific flash of fire. While trying to hide a forbidden cigarette, her flammable tulle gown ignited, turning a secret act of rebellion into a fatal inferno. This article will explore the shocking details of her death in 1867 and the dark, lingering question that followed. Was it a tragic accident, or was it the desperate final act of a young woman choosing to burn rather than submit to a forced political marriage she desperately wanted to escape? To understand the immense pressure on a young woman like Mathilde, you first have to understand the institution she was born into, the Imperial House of Habsburg. This wasn't just a royal family, it was a quasi-religious institution, a dynasty that had ruled over vast swathes of Europe for more than 600 years. By the mid-19th century, their power was concentrated in the sprawling multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, a patchwork of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, and many others, all held together by their loyalty or enforced obedience to the emperor in Vienna. The glue that held this fragile empire together wasn't just military might, it was tradition. And at the heart of that tradition was the Spanish court etiquette. This wasn't just a set of polite manners, it was a rigid, suffocating, and almost theatrical code of conduct that had been imported from the deeply conservative Spanish court centuries earlier. It dictated every single moment of a Habsburg's life, from the cradle to the grave. It prescribed how they should walk, talk, eat, and dress. Every gesture was choreographed. Every word was weighed. A public meal was a silent, solemn ritual. A greeting was a complex ballet of bows and curtsies. Spontaneity was a sin. Emotion was a weakness to be concealed. Imagine growing up in this world. Your life is a public performance from the day you are born. You are constantly surrounded by courtiers, ladies in waiting, and tutors, all watching, all judging, ensuring you adhere to the ancient protocol. For the archdukes and archduchesses of the imperial family, there was no private life as we would understand it. Their purpose was singular: to embody the majesty, the stability, and the unyielding tradition of the Habsburg dynasty. Their marriages were not affairs of the heart, they were transactions, pieces moved on the great chessboard of European diplomacy. An archduchess was, first and foremost, a political asset, a womb destined to produce heirs to secure an alliance. Love was a happy accident, but never a prerequisite. Presiding over this rigid world was Emperor Franz Joseph I. He had come to the throne in 1848 at the tender age of 18 in the midst of a violent revolution that had nearly torn the empire apart. His predecessor had been forced to abdicate, and a relative had been executed. This baptism by fire forged Franz Joseph into the man he would be for the next 68 years. A deeply conservative, unimaginative, and work-obsessed monarch who saw himself as the first servant of the state. He was the ultimate bureaucrat, a man who found comfort in paperwork and military uniforms. He saw change as a threat and tradition as the only bulwark against chaos. His personal motto was Viribus Unitas, with united forces. But following a humiliating defeat in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, the empire was anything but united. This forced him to fundamentally restructure the state, leading to the pivotal year of 1867, the very year of Mathilde's death. It was in this year that the Austro-Hungarian Compromise, Ausgleich, was enacted, granting Hungary equal status and creating the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. This was a moment of extreme political fragility and transformation for the Habsburgs. The pressure to secure alliances and project an image of stability was at its absolute peak. Matilda's proposed marriage to the Italian heir was not just a diplomatic nicety, it was a critical component of Emperor Franz Joseph's strategy to stabilize his newly reformed and vulnerable empire. And then there was his wife, the Empress Elizabeth, famously known as Sisi. If Franz Joseph was the embodiment of Habsburg duty, Sisi was the spirit of rebellion. A Bavarian duchess married to the emperor in a glittering ceremony, she was a wild, free spirit who found the Spanish court etiquette and the stifling atmosphere of Vienna utterly unbearable. She was obsessed with her beauty, her waist famously measuring a mere 19 inches, and she spent hours each day on her elaborate hair care and exercise routines. But these were more than vanity. They were acts of control in a life where she felt she had none. Sisi constantly sought to escape Vienna, traveling restlessly across Europe, writing melancholy poetry, and openly defying the court's expectations. For a young archduchess like Matilda, growing up in the 1850s and 60s, the dynamic between the dutiful emperor and the rebellious empress would have been the central drama of her world. Sisi was a cautionary tale whispered by courtiers, a symbol of the dangers of emotional indulgence. But for a young girl with a budding independent spirit, Sisi must also have been an object of intense fascination, a tantalizing glimpse of a life lived on one's own terms. However, tragically, the tension between duty and desire, conformity and rebellion was personified by the imperial couple themselves, and it set the stage for the personal conflict that would ultimately consume Matilda. While Emperor Franz Joseph presided over the empire, Matilda belonged to a cadet branch of the family, the House of Teschen. But this was no minor offshoot. In fact, her father was arguably the most powerful and influential Habsburg outside of the emperor himself. Her father was Archduke Albrecht, Duke of Teschen. Born in 1817, Albrecht was the personification of the old Habsburg military aristocracy. He was a career soldier, a field marshal who had dedicated his life to the army. He was disciplined, unyielding, and possessed a deep-seated belief in the absolute power of the monarchy and the importance of military strength. He was a hero of the recent Austro-Prussian War, having won the Battle of Custoza against the Italians in 1866, one of Austria's few victories in that disastrous conflict. This military success cemented his reputation and gave him immense prestige at court. But Albrecht wasn't just a rich and respected war hero. He was, for the entire second half of the 19th century, the de facto commander and most powerful man in the military. Following the 1866 war, the army was reorganized, and in 1869 he was appointed Inspector General of the Austro-Hungarian Army, a position of supreme influence he held until his death in 1895. This elevates him from being merely a stern father to one of the central pillars of the state. His word was law, making Matilda's defiance, however small, an act against an almost absolute authority. But Albrecht was more than just a soldier. He was fabulously wealthy. He had inherited the vast Teschen estates, which included huge tracts of land, mines, and factories, making him one of the richest men in Europe. His main residence in Vienna was a magnificent palace right next to the Imperial Hofburg, a building we know today as the Albertina Museum. This was Matilda's childhood home, a place of immense art and luxury, but also a fortress of the conservatism her father championed. Archduke Albrecht was a man who saw the liberalizing trends of the 19th century, democracy, nationalism, personal freedom, as a disease that threatened to destroy the world he knew and loved. He was a stern, demanding, and perhaps emotionally distant father, a man who would have expected nothing less than absolute obedience from his children. Matilda's mother was Princess Hildegard of Bavaria, a member of the House of Wittelsbach. This made her a first cousin to Empress Sisi. Hildegard was known for her kindness and gentle nature, a softer presence in the stern household of Archduke Albrecht. She was a devoted mother to her 3 children, Maria Theresia, born in 1845, Matilda in 1849, and a son, Karl Albrecht, who tragically died of smallpox at just 18 months old. The loss of her only son and heir was a deep sorrow for the family, and likely intensified the focus on the dynastic duties of the 2 surviving daughters. The family divided their time between the formal grandeur of the Albertina in Vienna and their beloved summer residence, Schloss Weilburg, a beautiful neoclassical palace in Baden-Bay, Wien. Weilburg was their escape, a place of comparative freedom where the girls could enjoy the gardens and the fresh country air. It was a happy place, but this happiness was to be cruelly cut short. In 1864, a profound tragedy struck the family. Princess Hildegard had traveled to Munich to attend the funeral of her brother, King Maximilian II of Bavaria. While there, she contracted lung inflammation and pleurisy. She returned to Vienna gravely ill and died shortly after. Matilda was just 15 years old. The loss of her gentle, loving mother was a devastating blow. It removed the primary source of warmth and affection from her life and left her and her sister entirely under the control of their formidable, unbending father. From this point on, Archduke Albrecht's will and his plans for his daughters' futures would be absolute and unchallenged. For Matilda, this was a pivotal moment. The buffer between her own developing personality and her father's rigid expectations was gone. As she entered the final years of her adolescence, the years in which a young woman's future is decided, she was more alone and vulnerable than ever before. Her father's focus would now turn to his sole remaining duty as he saw it, securing the most politically advantageous marriage possible for his beautiful and now motherless daughter. The cage door was beginning to close. Against this backdrop of imperial grandeur, political tension, and personal loss, Archduchess Mathilde grew from a girl into a young woman. What do we know of her personality? Contemporary descriptions are filtered through the formal language of the court, but a consistent picture emerges of a young woman who was not only beautiful, but possessed a lively, intelligent, and spirited nature. She was said to have inherited her mother's delicate Bavarian looks, and her beauty was a subject of note at court. But unlike some of her more reserved Habsburg relatives, Matilda had a spark. She was known for her charm and a certain vivaciousness that could light up a room. She shared a very close bond with her older sister, Maria Theresia. The two were often seen together navigating the treacherous waters of court society as a team. They were each other's confidant and ally in a world that demanded constant performance. Matilda's education, typical for an archduchess, was rigorous. She would have been fluent in German, French, Italian, and likely Hungarian and Czech. She studied history, literature, and music, but her true passion seems to have been for the arts, particularly the theater. The family were great patrons of the arts in Vienna, and attending the opera or a play was a regular part of their social calendar. For Matilda, the theater was more than just entertainment. It was a window into another world, a world of grand emotions, of passion, tragedy, and romance, all the things that were so rigorously suppressed in her own life. It was a world where people spoke their hearts and followed their desires, a stark contrast to the silent, coded world of the Habsburg court. This love for the theater hints at a deeply romantic and expressive soul, a personality that was ill-suited to the emotional desert of her daily existence. As she entered her late teens, Matilda was officially introduced to court society. This would have meant attending the legendary Viennese balls, dazzling affairs held in the grand halls of the Hofburg Palace, where thousands of candles would glitter on military uniforms and diamond tiaras, and the music of Johann Strauss would set the city spinning. For any young woman, this would be a heady, exciting experience, but for an archduchess, it was also the beginning of the marriage market. Every dance, every conversation was scrutinized. She was no longer just her father's daughter. She was a potential bride, a future queen, a political asset to be assessed and ultimately deployed. It was in this glittering, high-stakes environment that Matilda began to attract attention. Her beauty, her father's immense wealth and influence, and her direct connection to the main line of the Habsburgs made her one of the most eligible princesses in Europe. Suitors and their emissaries would have been making discreet inquiries. Dynastic calculations were being made in the foreign ministries of Vienna, Rome, and beyond. For Matilda, this period must have been a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. There was the excitement of being a beautiful young woman at the center of the most glamorous court in Europe. But beneath it all, there must have been a growing sense of dread. The freedom of her childhood, limited as it was slipping away. Her future was a path being laid out for her by others, a path that led not to a life of her own choosing, but to a throne in a foreign land. She was on the verge of womanhood, but also on the verge of losing herself completely. The match was about to be lit. When we last saw Archduchess Mathilde, she was a beautiful, spirited young woman on the cusp of her formal entry into the glittering, treacherous world of European high society. Motherless at 15 and living under the watchful eye of her formidable and deeply conservative father, Archduke Albrecht, she was a perfect imperial princess in the making. But beneath the flawless exterior of silks and pearls, a passionate and independent spirit yearned for a life beyond the rigid choreography of the Habsburg court. As she took her place in the grand ballroom of the Hofburg Palace, she was, in essence, being placed on display. She had become one of the most eligible, and therefore most valuable, princesses in Europe. Her future was a matter of intense negotiation, a question of political and dynastic importance. But in the midst of these cold calculations, a flicker of something else appeared, a brief, tantalizing glimpse of a different life, a different future, embodied in one of the most unconventional princes of her time. Among the dozens of archdukes who populated the sprawling Habsburg family tree, there were the soldiers, the administrators, and the formal figureheads. And then there was Archduke Ludwig Salvator, a member of the Italian branch of the family, the House of Habsburg-Tuscany. Ludwig Salvator was a man utterly, gloriously out of step with his time and his station. Born in Florence in 1847, he was Matilda's near-exact contemporary, and in temperament, he was her opposite in every way that mattered to the court, and her kindred spirit in every way that mattered to the soul. From a young age, Ludwig Salvator displayed a profound disinterest in the pomp and ceremony of royal life. He was not interested in military parades, political power, or dynastic marriages. His passions were for the natural world, for science, and for the diverse cultures of the Mediterranean. He was a brilliant linguist, eventually mastering more than a dozen languages, including Catalan, Greek, and Arabic. He was a gifted artist and a passionate naturalist, his mind captivated by the study of insects, plants, and the geology of the lands he explored. He was, in short, a scholar, an ethnographer, and an adventurer trapped in the body of a Habsburg archduke. As a young man, he made it clear to the emperor, Franz Joseph, that he had no intention of following a traditional royal path. He used his considerable personal fortune not to build palaces, but to fund scientific expeditions. He purchased a steam yacht, the Nix, a mythical water spirit, and made it his true home. He sailed the length and breadth of the Mediterranean, a bohemian prince with a wild beard and simple clothes, often being mistaken for a simple sailor. He documented the islands of the Balearics, particularly Majorca, with a scientific rigor and a poetic love that resulted in a monumental, multi-volume encyclopedia, Die Balearen. This was his life's work. Imagine this figure appearing in the stiff, formal, and utterly predictable world of the Viennese court. When he was obliged to attend functions at the Hofburg, he must have stood out like a rare, exotic bird. While other archdukes discussed military maneuvers and court gossip, Ludwig Salvator could speak of the migration patterns of dolphins or the unique dialect of a tiny Greek island. For a young woman like Mathilde, whose world was a gilded cage and whose passion for the arts and theater hinted at a desire for a life of greater emotional and intellectual depth, meeting him must have been a revelation. Whispers began to circulate at court of a special connection between the beautiful, spirited Archduchess Mathilde and the eccentric scholar prince. It's unlikely this was a full-blown secret romance in the way we might imagine it. The constant surveillance of court life would have made that almost impossible. It was more likely a meeting of minds, a profound and immediate recognition of a kindred spirit. We can picture them, perhaps finding a moment of quiet conversation in the vast imperial library, or walking in the meticulously manicured gardens of Schönbrunn Palace, their conversation a world away from the stilted formalities around them. He would have represented an escape not just physically to a sun-drenched island, but intellectually and spiritually to a world where curiosity was valued more than conformity, and personal passion was more important than public duty. This connection, this burgeoning affection, would have given Mathilde something she had likely never had before: hope. The hope that her life might not have to be a cold dynastic transaction. The hope that she could be married to a man who saw her not as a political asset, but as an intellectual equal, a partner in a life of discovery. Ludwig Salvator was by birth her equal, a Habsburg archduke, a suitable match surely. But in the cold, hard calculus of her father and the emperor, he was anything but. He brought no army, no strategic territory, no powerful new alliance. He was a dreamer, a scholar. And in the eyes of a pragmatist like Archduke Albrecht, that made him utterly worthless. The glimmer of hope that Ludwig Salvator represented was about to be brutally extinguished by the unbending reality of 19th century geopolitics. While Mathilde may have been dreaming of a life of scholarship and sea voyages, her father, Archduke Albrecht, was looking at a map. And the most problematic area on that map, from Austria's perspective, was its southern border with the newly formed Kingdom of Italy. The unification of Italy, completed in the 1860s, had been achieved largely at Austria's expense. The Habsburgs had been driven out of Lombardy and Venetia after a series of bloody wars. The relationship between the two powers was poisoned by resentment, suspicion, and competing territorial claims. Austria still controlled lands such as Trieste and the Trentino that Italian nationalists considered Italia irredenta, unredeemed Italy. The border was a tinderbox, and both nations eyed each other with deep hostility. In the world of 19th century diplomacy, when relations between two great powers were this poor, there were two options: war or marriage. Having just fought and lost a major war against Prussia and its Italian allies in 1866, Austria was in no position for another conflict. The alternative was a dynastic alliance, a tradition as old as the monarchies themselves. The idea was simple: weave the ruling families together so tightly that war becomes a form of fratricide. A marriage could open lines of communication, build personal relationships between the courts, and signal a mutual desire to de-escalate tensions. And Archduke Albrecht had the perfect peace offering. His beautiful, highly eligible, and completely obedient, he assumed, daughter, Matilda. The chosen groom was Umberto of Savoy, Prince of Piedmont, and heir to the Italian throne. Born in 1844, Umberto was 5 years Matilde's senior. He was the son of Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of a unified Italy. Like Matilda's father, Umberto was a military man, groomed from birth for a life of duty and command. He had fought against the Austrians in the recent war at the very same Battle of Custoza, where Archduke Albrecht had been the victorious commander. The irony was stark. The daughter of the winning general was to be married to the son of the losing king, a symbolic act of reconciliation. But what of the man himself? Prince Umberto was, by all accounts, the polar opposite of Ludwig Salvator. Where Ludwig Salvator was a warm, curious intellectual, Umberto was described as cold, stern, and unimaginative. He was conservative in his views, rigid in his demeanor, and possessed none of the charm or cultural refinement that characterized the Viennese court. His interests were hunting and the military. He was a man of duty, not of passion, a man who saw marriage as a dynastic necessity and little else. He would later be known as the Good King, Re Buono, for his courage during a cholera epidemic, but he would also be assassinated in 1900 by an anarchist who held him responsible for a massacre of protesters. He was a complex and in many ways a tragic figure himself. For Matilda, the news of this proposed engagement must have been a death sentence to her spirit. Imagine the scene. She is summoned to her father's study in the Grand Albertina Palace. The formidable Archduke Albrecht, a man who had commanded armies and who tolerated no dissent, informs her of her destiny. She is to marry the heir to the Italian throne. She is to become the future queen of Italy. He would have presented it not as a proposal, but as a fact, a patriotic duty for the good of the empire. Her personal feelings on the matter would have been considered utterly irrelevant. The horror must have been multi-layered. She was being sent to a foreign court, to a country that was, until very recently, Austria's bitter enemy. She would be surrounded by strangers, her every move scrutinized, and she would be bound for life to a man she did not know, a man who represented the death of all her secret hopes. The dream of a life with Ludwig Salvator, a life of intellectual companionship and freedom, evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by the cold, hard reality of a political marriage, a life sentence of formal duty in a gilded cage, just one located in Rome instead of Vienna. Her despair must have been absolute, and in that despair the seeds of a secret, desperate rebellion began to take root. In a life where every public action was scripted and every choice was made by others, how does a person carve out a space for themselves? How do they assert their own identity, even if only to themselves? For Archduchess Mathilde, trapped between her father's will and her own desires, the answer came in a small paper-wrapped cylinder of tobacco. She began to smoke. To us in the 21st century, this might seem a trivial act. But in the 1860s, for a young woman of her exalted rank, it was an act of profound and shocking rebellion. At the time, smoking for women was heavily stigmatized. It was an activity associated with the fringes of society, with actresses, dancers, bohemian writers, and women of loose morals. It was seen as distinctly unfeminine, a usurpation of a male prerogative. For a Habsburg archduchess who was meant to be a paragon of purity, piety, and docile femininity, to smoke was unthinkable. It was a direct and deliberate defiance of every social and moral code she was expected to uphold. This is why her smoking cannot be seen as a simple youthful indiscretion or a bad habit. It was a deeply psychological act. It was a secret ritual of selfhood. We can imagine her waiting for a moment when her ladies-in-waiting were occupied, stealing away to a quiet corner of her apartments in the vast palace. The act of striking the match, of drawing the smoke, of watching it curl in the air, this was a ceremony of freedom. For those few minutes, she was not Archduchess Mathilde, the political pawn, the future Queen of Italy. She was just Mathilde, a young woman making a choice, controlling her own actions, indulging in a forbidden pleasure. The cigarette was a tiny, flammable symbol of her autonomy. Her father, Archduke Albrecht, a man of rigid military discipline and old-world values, would have been utterly horrified had he known. His disapproval would not have been merely about health or propriety. He would have seen it as a sign of a dangerous character flaw, a rebellious streak that threatened to undermine the family's honor and her suitability for the important role she was destined to play. The need for secrecy, therefore, was paramount. This made the act even more potent. It was hers and hers alone. And so, this secret habit became an integral part of her silent battle against her fate. As the pressure of the Italian engagement mounted, as the wedding plans proceeded without her consent, her reliance on these stolen moments likely grew. The cigarette was her confidant, her small comfort in a world that offered her none. It was a tiny flame she could control in a life that was spiraling into a darkness she could not. It is a tragic and terrible irony that this small symbol of her fight for freedom, this little flame of rebellion, would become the very instrument of her destruction. The fire she played with in secret was a foreshadowing of the inferno that would ultimately consume her. The year is 1867. The season is turning towards summer. For Archduchess Mathilde, it is the winter of her soul. The engagement to Prince Umberto of Italy, once a distant political maneuver, is now a looming, inescapable reality. The diplomatic machinery is in motion. Her life, her future, her very body have been promised to another country for the sake of a fragile peace. The brief, hopeful dream of a life of intellectual partnership with Ludwig Salvator has faded into a bitter memory. She is 18 years old, and she is trapped. Every rustle of a courtier's silk dress, every formal dinner, every polite inquiry about her future is another bar locking her into her gilded cage. It is against this backdrop of mounting despair and silent desperation that the final terrible act of her life is about to unfold. The day was June 6, 1867. The location was Schloss Weilburg, the family's beautiful country palace near the spa town of Baden. Away from the oppressive formality of Vienna, Weilburg should have been a place of respite. But on this day, there was no escape. The family was preparing for an evening out, an excursion to the theater. For Mathilde, a lover of the stage, this should have been a welcome distraction. The theater was her beloved escape, a place of drama and emotion. But on this night, it was just another command performance, another public appearance she was expected to make as the perfect, beautiful daughter of the great Archduke Albrecht. Her state of mind can only be imagined. Was she numb with resignation? Was a storm of silent rage and terror brewing beneath her calm exterior? We will never know for certain, but we do know that she was preparing to be seen, to be displayed. And for this, she was dressed in the height of 1860s fashion. Her gown was an elaborate creation of white tulle. Tulle is a fine, lightweight, net-like fabric, prized for its ethereal cloud-like quality. It was perfect for creating the voluminous, floating skirts that were so fashionable. Beneath the tulle, she would have worn a crinoline cage, a large bell-shaped structure made of steel hoops that held the skirt out. This fashion, while creating a dramatic silhouette, was a death trap. The crinoline not only made movement cumbersome, but it created a sort of chimney effect. If the hem of the dress caught fire, the flames would be drawn upwards in an instant, funneling the fire and heat towards the wearer's body. The fabric itself was lethally flammable. Tulle and muslin dresses of the era were often treated with starch to keep them crisp, rendering them as flammable as paper. Dress fires were a terrifyingly common feature of 19th century life. Oscar Wilde's half-sisters Emily and Mary died in 1871 after one of their ball gowns caught fire from a fireplace. In 1861, the wife of the famous poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow died in a similar manner. The danger was well known, yet the fashion persisted. For a woman to wear such a dress was to adorn herself in a beautiful, highly combustible work of art. As Mathilde stood in her room, a vision in white, she was, in a very practical sense, surrounded by kindling. She was a candle waiting for a spark. The family was readying to depart. The carriages were likely waiting. In the final moments before they were due to leave, Mathilde sought one last, small act of private rebellion. One final cigarette. She retreated to her rooms, a place that should have been her sanctuary. She lit the cigarette, and for a fleeting second she was in control. She was not a princess, not a bride-to-be, but simply a young woman claiming a moment for herself. And then, a sound in the corridor. The firm, unmistakable footsteps of her father, Archduke Albrecht. Panic must have seized her. Her father, the embodiment of discipline and tradition, the architect of her dreaded future, was coming. To be discovered in this forbidden act would be unthinkable. It would bring a storm of disapproval, a lecture on duty and propriety, a confirmation in his eyes of a willfulness that needed to be stamped out before her marriage. In a reflexive, desperate motion, she swung around and thrust the lit cigarette behind her back, attempting to conceal it within the voluminous folds of her tulle dress. The contact was instantaneous. The lit end of the cigarette touched the feather-light, highly flammable fabric. There was no slow smolder. It was an explosion of light and heat. A single spark, and the delicate tulle ignited as if it had been soaked in gasoline. The fire, fed by the air circulating under the crinoline cage, roared up her back in a terrifying rush. Her screams, sounds of pure animal terror and agony, tore through the elegant silence of the palace. The first to reach her was the very man she had tried to hide from, her father. Archduke Albrecht burst into the room to see his daughter engulfed in flames, a living statue of fire. Casting aside all thought for his own safety, he lunged at her, trying to beat out the flames with his bare hands, suffering severe burns in the process. Other family members and servants rushed in with blankets and rugs, desperately trying to smother the inferno that had once been a ball gown. But it was hopeless. The fire had been too fast, too ferocious. By the time they managed to extinguish the flames, the damage was done. The beautiful dress was a blackened, smoking ruin, and beneath it, Mathilde had suffered catastrophic, third-degree burns across most of her back, neck, and arms. He was still alive, but the medical science of 1867 could offer little more than morphine for the unimaginable pain. In an era before germ theory was widely accepted, there was no understanding of bacterial infection, no antibiotics, and no concept of sterile procedure for treating burn wounds. For a patient with such extensive injuries, death was a medical certainty. Even if she had survived the initial shock, a fatal infection, sepsis, would have been unavoidable. She lingered for hours in agony, her short, vibrant life burning out in a haze of shock and suffering. Later that same day, on June 6, 1867, Archduchess Mathilde of Austria died. She was just 18 years old. The beautiful, spirited princess, who had dreamed of a life of freedom and romance, had met her end in a private hell, consumed by a fire ignited by her own small act of defiance. The official story was written almost immediately. It was a tragic, unforeseeable accident. The court circulars and the carefully controlled newspapers of Vienna would have reported the death of the beloved Archduchess with profound sorrow, attributing it to the unfortunate combination of a lit cigarette and a flammable dress. It was a story that was simple, shocking, and, crucially, blameless. It was a domestic tragedy, not a dynastic crisis. It preserved the pristine image of the imperial family, portraying Matilda as a victim of misfortune, not of despair. And yet, almost as quickly as the official narrative was established, a darker, more troubling interpretation began to be whispered in the drawing rooms and back quarters of Vienna. It has persisted ever since, transforming Matilda's story from a simple accident into a profound psychological mystery. Was her death truly accidental, or was it, in some form, an act of suicide? There is no suicide note, no final confession. The evidence is purely circumstantial, rooted in our understanding of her state of mind. The argument for suicide, or at least for a subconscious act of self-destruction, is compelling. Consider the facts we know. Matilda was a sensitive, intelligent, and spirited young woman. She was facing a future she dreaded, a forced marriage to a man she did not love, for political reasons she could not support. This marriage meant the definitive end of any hope for a life with a man she may have loved, Archduke Ludwig Salvator, who represented everything she yearned for. Her mother, her only source of gentle support, was dead. Her father was an unbending authoritarian who would not be moved. She was, in every meaningful sense, completely trapped. In this context, her final act takes on a different light. The hurried, panicked motion of hiding the cigarette, was it merely a clumsy reflex? Or was it, on some deeper level, a moment of fatalistic surrender? Could it have been an act of what psychologists might call suicidal gesture, a reckless act performed by someone so consumed by hopelessness that they no longer care about their own safety? Perhaps in that split second the thought was not, "I must hide this cigarette," but a far darker subconscious whispers of "what does it matter anymore?" To be clear, this doesn't mean she necessarily planned to set herself on fire. It suggests a state of such profound despair that her will to live, her instinct for self-preservation, had been eroded to almost nothing. The fire, in this interpretation, was not the cause of her death, but merely the method. The true cause was the crushing weight of a system that denied her any agency over her own life. This theory transforms Matilda from a passive victim into a tragic protagonist. It gives her a final, terrible agency. Unable to escape her fate, she chose oblivion over submission. Whether it was a conscious choice or a subconscious surrender to the flames, this interpretation argues that her death was a direct result of the unbearable pressure placed upon her. It was not just an accident. It was a symptom of a sick and suffocating system. We can never know for certain what was in her heart in that final fiery moment. But the question itself is what gives her story its enduring tragic power. It forces us to see the fire not just as a physical event, but as a horrifying metaphor for a spirit that was being burned away on the inside. The death of Archduchess Mathilde sent a shock wave of genuine horror and grief through the Habsburg court and beyond. Her father, Archduke Albrecht, was said to have been devastated, not only by the loss of his daughter, but by the horrific manner of her death and his own inability to save her. He had been burned himself in the attempt, physical scars that would serve as a permanent reminder of his loss. The news would have eventually reached the wandering Archduke Ludwig Salvator on his yacht in the Mediterranean. We have no record of his immediate reaction, but it is a deeply poignant fact of history that he never married. He dedicated the rest of his long life to his travels, his scientific work, and a series of discreet relationships. But he never took a wife. One is left to wonder if the memory of the beautiful, spirited Archduchess he once knew played a part in that decision. The political ramifications were immediate. The carefully planned Austro-Italian marriage alliance was, quite literally, ashes. The diplomatic gambit to soothe relations had failed in the most gruesome way imaginable. A new bride would have to be found for Prince Umberto. He would eventually marry his first cousin, the beautiful Princess Margherita of Savoy, who would become the beloved first queen of Italy and the namesake of the Margherita pizza. The great wheels of European diplomacy simply ground on, finding another princess to serve the purpose. Matilda, in death as in life, was ultimately a replaceable piece in their game, but her story left other, more lasting echoes. Her horrifying death became a high-profile, cautionary tale about the very real dangers of Victorian fashion. While it didn't end the trend of crinoline and tulle overnight, it added a powerful voice to the growing chorus calling for safer clothing for women. It made the abstract danger terrifyingly concrete. More profoundly, Matilda's story has become a potent symbol of the inner lives of 19th century royal women. Her death was an early chapter in a long series of tragedies that plagued Emperor Franz Joseph's reign, often referred to as a family curse. In the very same month Matilda died, the emperor's own brother, Maximilian I, Emperor of Mexico, was executed by firing squad. This was followed by the suicide of his only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, at Mayerling in 1889, the assassination of his wife, Empress Sisi, in 1898, and ultimately the assassination of his nephew and heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in 1914, which triggered World War I. This context frames Matilda's story as part of a larger generational saga of death and murder that haunts the dynasty. In a final tragic footnote, the very location of her death is now gone. Schloss Weilburg, the beautiful palace where she died, was completely destroyed by fire during the final days of World War II in 1945. The physical setting of her horrifying death no longer exists, having been consumed by another fire almost 80 years later, turning the place into a lost memory. Her story forces us to look past the magnificent portraits and the grand palaces, to see the fragile human heart beating within the corseted gown. It is a devastating reminder that a gilded cage is still a cage, and that the human spirit, when denied all hope of escape, may seek the most desperate of liberations. But the question of what truly ignited it, a careless spark or a soul in despair, continues to burn, a small, unextinguished flame in the long, dark corridor of history. It reminds us that behind every great name is a human story, and some stories, like Matilda's, are written in fire.